What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass. I'm here, just Dr. Helms without Dr. Trexler. We have been going live for the last few weeks, so thank you to everyone who's joined us live on YouTube. This is a pre-recorded episode. Before I introduce our awesome guest today, I just want to say thank you so much for supporting the show. And if you really want to keep supporting the show, do us a favor. If you're on YouTube, give us a like, give us a subscribe, chuck a comment in the area below. Let us know what you like about the show. And if you're on any other podcast platform, do us a favor. Take a second, give us a 5-star rating, please. It's the only way we can progress. But actually, the real way that we can progress and what allows us to keep doing this show, if you really want to be one of those key members of the cult, is consider joining Mass, massresearchreview.com, where not only do you get to hear video and audio content, much like what we're doing today with our guest, but also you can see the most recent research reviewed that will hopefully give you insights that even take things further and help you with application, whether you're a trainer, an athlete yourself, or just someone really serious about your training. So without further ado, I would like to say, hey, big welcome to Dr. Stian Larsen for coming on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Eric. It's an honor. I've been a fan of your podcast for many years since I wrote my bachelor thesis. So it's really, really a big honor for me to be here.
Well, no, truly the honor is mine. One thing we love to do at Iron Culture is try to give a platform to researchers who are coming up, doing important work, expanding our knowledge in the space of the thing we love, the iron. And you're doing exactly that, and you have been doing it for a while. So, Stian, I want to start this off with a brief story that should give people a sense of humility, where I got an email from a young gentleman who did not have doctor in front of his name yet, but he had your name, Stian Larsen, and he said, hey, pretty sure your standard deviations are all messed up in your research, and you're an idiot. Now, I might have read that last part, and you're an idiot, between the lines. That might have been something that I took that you didn't say, so I'm not going to put that on you. But I remember the first time you emailed, I think it was early 2020, pre-COVID, and I got an email, and you mentioned, dude, there's an error in your standard deviations. I'm looking at, I think you were considering doing a meta-analysis or at least some summary statistics and a systematic review on autoregulation. And I was like, damn it, he's right. Like, we made a boo-boo there. And that started our conversations, and we found out we were both writing very similar reviews, or trying to publish very similar reviews on autoregulation. And what started with a conversation about potentially collaborating actually became you inviting me, and I was hugely honored to be an external supervisor on your master's degree. So we've actually been collaborating for, I guess it's coming up on 5 years now. But I don't want to tell the story. I'll let you tell it. Talk to me about your educational career, where you started. Did you start as a lifter, a practitioner, and how you got to be in the position you are in today as the Director of Education at AFPT, the Academy for Personal Training out there in Norway, which, by the way, a little more background, then I'll let you talk. I love the AFPT. Big shout out to Espen. I've actually been collaborating with them 10 years, believe it or not. 2015 was the first year they invited me out to Norway to speak at their conference, and this is, in my opinion, just an amazing organization that is doing great work educating personal trainers and always making a premium out of evidence-based approaches and always trying to push the field forward and never sacrificing quality. And they've had some amazing speakers, amazing science communicators collaborating with them who are international, and they've done a fantastic job in Norway. And no, I'll plant a seed, but no spoiler. All I'll say is that AFPT is making a push, which I think is great, to uplift the personal training market even more so and upskill even more personal trainers. But I will shut up. Stian, talk to me about your background.
Yeah, so my background, I started lifting when I was 14 years old, so I was a pretty young guy. I was pretty interested in bicep curls and bench press, so I tried to increase that. So that's really my first experience with lifting. But I started powerlifting when I was around 10, 12 years ago. So I signed up for that at the fitness center called Nidar in Trondheim in Norway. and I started the powerlifting there. And cool story, but the owner there has the world record squat, unofficial squat in the naked squat. So he took the world record, and guess who spotted him? That was me.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool, to be honest. But yeah, I started powerlifting, and my first.
So hold on, we got to take a detour here. So this is real raw. This is unequipped to the nth degree. This is no belt, no sleeves, no shirt, no socks, no shoes, no underwear. But spotters are allowed. I guess people are comfortable with that, and except maybe the spotters themselves.
Yeah, that's correct. So he was invited to a program, a region program called Norden Særliste with the Ylvis brothers. I'm not sure if you have heard the song "What Does the Fox Say?" It's a very, very known song. These are them, and he was invited there, so he took an official squat record. I do think the original squat holder was a Finnish dude or something, but I squatted 190, but then I squatted 230 kilos or something. But a couple of years later, he was invited to a Norwegian talent show, so he was squatted naked in front of 2,000 people or something, I think. And I was spotting him from the side, so that was a day I'll never forget. But yeah, so that's a cool story. But yeah.
Okay, so at least you were a side spotter. So you had that either going for you or that disappointment. I'm not sure how you felt about that.
Yeah, I don't think I will say anything about that, but it was a day that I will never forget. So
I think that's a fair statement.
yeah. So, but back to the story. I started powerlifting 12 years ago. When I started with an online program from a Norwegian powerlifting coach. I do think he was the head coach at the time, Dietmar Wolf. So he had some online programs. So I started doing that, and after 3 months, I do think I increased my squat with 30 to 40 kilos or something. I was a beginner, so I was pretty happy with that. But the problem was that I hadn't any plan after that, so I didn't increase my squat, bench, or deadlift for 1.5 to 2 years after that, I think. I just took random programs and didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. But what was really interesting was that I squatted with a high bar technique all the time, and I was not so good in that. So it was a Monday, I remember, and I was going to squat for a heavy single, and I failed the lift. And the day after, I just decided to try low bar, and I do think I increased my one arm just by changing technique with 15 kilos. So for me, that was really, I don't think I've ever been so glad in a gym, to be honest, because just changing technique from a high bar narrow stance to more low bar wide stance, I managed to lift a lot more. I do think it was 15 or 12.5 kilos. I can't say for sure. But for me, that was pretty much, I do think that's an outlier when you're comparing different techniques, because I do think in my studies it's typical 3 to 5 kilos more in the low bar. Also some studies where we haven't really seen any differences when we really standardize everything else. But that was pretty cool. And also, I didn't know what I was doing, so I didn't get stronger. But then I got a coach, and I started eating more. He coached me on nutrition. And also, my total exploded, to say it very easy. So for me, that was really the first. This was my introduction to having a good coach, but also the biomechanics. So I started just studying sports science after that in 2017, I think, or 2016, and I was really interested in both biomechanics, but also program design, how to try to program a training program for increasing strength. So that was really my background. So from a bachelor's, I did a kinematic analysis. I was going to do a kinetic analysis, but the motion capture system malfunctioned, so I wasn't able to do that. But for my master's, I had a great co-supervisor. So that was you, by the way. So we did publications together, comparing both barbell placement and stance fit. So for my master's, I did in an inverse dynamics analysis. meaning that we estimated the net joint moments between different techniques in the back squat. And long story short, I did the same for my PhD. But for my PhD, I wanted to take it a step further and do what's called static optimizations. So that's when we take and we estimate the net joint moment at the given joints, and then we try to divide it into individual muscle forces to see how technique and load influences muscle forces and muscle specific moments. So that was pretty much what I did for my PhD. But all the way, I have also been always a coach. So I coached a lot of clients. I've also been so lucky that I run a fitness center company. We had 5 fitness centers beside my PhD. So I was able to do a lot of data collections there. So big shout out to the owners there. Care, it's called, but now it's sold. So that's sad, but still. That was a lot of job, and I'm really, really thankful for that they gave me the opportunity to run their centers and also do the PhD through them, so they finance my PhD. So yeah, and also just to provide this on additional context, my problem all the way is that I don't really have a biomechanical background. For in school, I studied sports science, and we don't really have a lot of biomechanics. So for me, during my PhD, I was going to do musculoskeletal molding, and that's quite complex, to be honest. There's a lot of model adjustments and parameters and decisions you have to do, and trying to understand everything of them is quite hard. So I basically 2 out of 3 years of my PhD, I just try to understand everything, trying to delve deep into the models and what different choices, how they really influence the output from a model, garbage in, garbage out. So midway through my PhD, I decided to do longitudinal studies. So that's really because I don't really trust every assumption in the model, to be honest. I do think the biomechanical community has done a really great job on improving these models, but still I do think it's a long way to go, especially in models where it's related to strength training, because it's quite hard to estimate these things. So I wanted to do longitudinal studies, and that's what I've done the last year and a half. So yeah, that's a short but long introduction.
Well, no, and I had the privilege of getting to sit side saddle with you through that and watch your progression to being far above mine in terms of biomechanics. And I think, a lot of people, when they see that someone is a sports scientist, they especially if they have a doctorate, they assume a certain level of knowledge. But I think what people may not realize is that technically a doctorate is a doctorate of philosophy, essentially, in your thesis topic. And you, depending upon the program, may have taken some classes, but essentially you just do a deep dive and read everything that exists on a given topic and try to disconfirm your hypotheses, and you end up becoming an expert in what you study. So I certainly would never describe myself as a biomechanist just because I have a PhD in sport and exercise. And if anything, I think people, they might know me as a general science communicator, but I will always defer to people who have more specific expertise. And, the areas where I do know my stuff, like I did a PhD in autoregulation. I did my master's thesis on protein manipulation. Those are things that I have high-level expertise in, but you simply cannot get that level of expertise across multiple domains. Because that's why it takes a full PhD, and in your case, a master's and a PhD in a topic, to get to a point where you have a little more confidence in what you know. And unfortunately, that confidence sometimes leads to, hold on, this is actually, I don't think I know what I thought I knew. So as an aside, I know you sought me out because some of the background research I had done. Shout out to Dr. Daniel Glassbrook. This was my second master's student who I was part of the supervisory team for during my PhD. And I actually got to participate in this research. And we did surface EMG, kinetics, and kinematics. So we had 8 Vicon cameras standing on dual platform force plate. And we actually even had weightlifters and powerlifters do snatches and clean and jerks Some of that data did not go well with wired EMG, I'm sure you could imagine, and things falling off and people getting sweaty. But we did get very good, cool comparisons, not on EMG, just kinetics and kinematics of high bar and low bar squat. And I look back on that data that we collected in 2014, I want to say, and I probably would not interpret it the same way today or make as strong of conclusions. And I know when we started together, I was, watching you write your master's thesis, collaborating with you. And then we got to a point in the PhD where I found my ability to give you useful feedback in, say, your methods or your results, or even understanding some aspects of your results became narrower. And my guidance was maybe a little more relegated to the things that were communication side of it. And how do we connect this to strength conditioning? So, yeah, as you've continued on, I'm really curious to hear, because you did stay with the same topic through your PhD after, I was no longer your advisor. When you look at the data on high bar versus low bar squats and the sticking region, and modeling data versus, the data we have, just comparing people, comparing strength, what are your conclusions? Are you relatively confident that low bar squats are going to produce stronger squats for most people? Because I also maybe I'm an outlier as well, but I can do a low bar squat with about 10% more than I can high bar squat. And I had a similar experience when I switched over after kind of acclimating to the movement. And I've actually kept high bar and low bar squatting throughout my career, at least when I was, not actively doing only bodybuilding as I am now. But when I was doing both, that 10% persisted. So, it was 205, 225, kind of like at my peak. So I'm curious to hear how your thoughts have evolved and the differences between the low bar and the high bar squat. And then also after that, what do you think about the sticking region? What causes it? And are there things we can learn about programming to try to address that to maybe gain strength faster? Or do you think that's a misguided attempt at trying to address the sticking region?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Eric. To be honest, I do think I'm more confused than ever. It's, that's the short answer. But yeah, during my PhD, we did try to investigate why the sticking region occurs, or what influences it. And so we did a study where we compared different barbell loads. So we compared, I do think it was 90% of one RM barbell load to 100% of one RM barbell load, and also a failed lift. And we saw how the kinematics and kinetics were influenced by the barbell load. So really what we saw was that when we increased barbell load from 90 to 100, and also from 100 to 102% of one RM, meaning from a successful lift to a failed lift, the only thing that increased was the hip net joint moments. Okay, so we did not see increased load on the quadriceps or the knee extensors. And I do think that's probably because I do think that the quads are working pretty hard at easier barbell loads. We have, for example, from another study of mine, this is unpublished, and the reason why this study I'm speaking about now is unpublished was because I do think it was a lot of noise in the modeling, so I did not really want to do it. But still, I do think it gives us some answers, but I don't feel confident about publishing it, but it has also been replicated with greater methods in the newly. I don't remember the researcher. So the quads seem to be working almost maximally around, I do think it's 75 to 90% of 1 RM. And when you then increase the barbell load further, they work maximally. So you have to self-organize your body, then moving a little bit forward. That's really why you do the stripper squats at more heavy lifts, as they call, meaning that knee extension occurs before hip extension. So you get a more forward lean. Then you change the loading from the knee extensors to the hip extensors. So really what I do think, and this is speculative, of course, because I haven't really made any correlations or something, and I do think this is really hard to say why it occurs, but I do think it's because the quads are really working maximally for most people. Then you change the demands or the loading to the hip, and you get increased power length. So the last thing that the limiting factor will be the hip extension torque that you can produce because the knee extensor are working maximally. So I do think that's a clever way to squat, and I do in almost every participant that I ever tested, this occurs. So they at lower barbell load, there's no problem for more advanced lifters to have an upright torso, but when it get heavy, they increase torso power lean and change the loading to the hip extensors. So that's one thing I do that's a consistent kinematic outcome, and also a consistent kinetic outcome that we see. And also for the modeling that's not published, but this has also been replicated. That's why I mention it. We saw that when we did musculoskeletal modeling with the static optimization, that the only hip extensor that increased musculoskeletal forces, but also muscle-specific moments, meaning the contribution to the net joint moment, was the gluteus maximus. And that was pretty interesting. I do think it's pretty logic that it wasn't the hamstring, because that's a biarticular muscle. So it will increase the knee flexor torque, which will make it harder to extend the knees, that I know that you have already covered. I do think it was in episode 67 of your show with Megan Brighton and Andrew Vygotsky. I do think I heard that episode 5 times or something because I really enjoyed the episode. So that's something. But the sticking region, easily it occurs because it's too heavy for you. So you have to grind, and you know that maximal forces are produced at slower barbell velocities. So I do think that's probably an interesting finding from a thesis, my PhD thesis. But also we know that when you have an eccentric phase, you will get stronger in the concentric phase. This is often called potentiation. I do think that's a unicorn in research, to be honest, because it can be a lot of factors influencing. But we can see that we have greater force production in dynamic movements, especially the squat, than in static or isometric actions in the squat. So we see that the increased force production due to the eccentric phase diminishes after around 0.3 seconds, which is very often where the sticking region starts. So where you have to wind. So I do think that's also a factor that influences the sticking region. So probably that the potentiation is diminished, and also that you change your loading from the knee extensor to the hip extensor. So the knee extensor are rolled maximally. They aren't really strong enough to extend the joints, so you are changing your self-organizing your body from the knee extensor to the hip extensors. And often what you see when people fail a lift is that they flex their spine, and that's probably because they aren't capable of producing enough hip extensor torque or hip extension moments. So then you have to flex the spine. And that's also something I've seen in an unpublished deadlift study that we have to pair review now. He compared 90 to 100. We compared a 90% of one RM deadlift to a maximal deadlift. And what we saw was that the hip extension moment didn't increase. What's increased was this spinal flexion. So I always said this as a coach. When you deadlift, spinal flexion is great for 1RM. Of course, we can discuss if it's safe or not. I do think it's safe if you have trained your spine to tolerate these loads. But that was also interesting to see. But I don't think it's possible to have a big flexion in the deadlift in the squat, because you have the barbell on your load, so you can't really do it there. So yeah.
I think that last bit is a really key point. You know, you can't have that much flexion in your spine during a squat because of the bar position, and I think that helps us with some of the interpretation of the data, and something that I don't know if we've talked about it on here, but I've implied it, is that when a study reports its data, it's not necessarily telling you what to do or interpreting it. You could take a crack at it in the discussion of the practical applications if that's part of the paper and when you do the science communication, but just simply reporting the data is only the first step. And I have definitely heard people who would agree on the idea that the quads are already at their limit, producing maximal torque through the movement, even at lighter loads, and then the loads get heavier and you have to bring the hip extensors more to the party. to complete the lift. But I've heard them disagree as to, okay, then, well, what should we do about that? Because I think it's probably true. If the quads are always exerting maximal force, then you could see them as a limiting factor, right? Because any 1-to-1 increase in quad strength should result in an increase in the net movement joint forces for the squat, because they're always contributing. They're a prime mover. But like you said, okay, when it gets heavy enough, when we reach our limit lift, we then start to increase the amount of hip joint activity. So that means, okay, someone else could say, well, no, that means we just need to build a massive posterior chain, train those glutes, maybe train those adductors, train the spinal erectors, and that's going to be what gets you through that load. And then I think that final thing you said about bar position. We can only have so much spinal flexion before it becomes a problem, because the bar's on our back. We can actually lose position. That, I think, is the key piece that sometimes people can't really think about, those second order effects. That if you do shift to an extremely hip dominant strategy in order to do a squat, you can put yourself in a position more holistically where now you're not in as strong of a biomechanically advantageous position, or you can actually lose the bar forward, which we sometimes see in people with really extreme kind of forward lean. Basically the lever arm of your torso becomes so long that you can't meet those demands anymore, regardless of the fact that you are using a lot of, and actually probably because you are using so much of your hip extensors without being able to, couple that movement and find a movement strategy that keeps that bar over your center of support or your center of gravity. So, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on, does this just mean we just need to be doing good mornings, back extensions, hip thrusts, or do you think that how that data is interpreted might change our programming decisions?
Yes, that's also a great question. And unfortunately, I have never done any studies on this, so I don't have any clue what's correct in the context of science. But if I can speculate as a coach, because I coached a lot of powerlifters, I do think it's obvious that both strengthening your quadriceps and the hip extensors are the way to go. But if there are any, what can I say, predictors of what you should do, that I'm more unsure of than ever before, because I heard a very good biomechanists say that if you fail in the bottom part of a squat, meaning you are very afraid of going deep, you fail out of the hole, you should strengthen your quadriceps. But also what we see in the bottom position is that you have pretty large hip extension demands as well. You have big loads. So I am very, very unsure of this, to be honest. But also, how is your technique, of course? Do you have short femurs? You have an upright position where you are capable of holding your torso upright. There are lifters that's capable of this on very, very high loads as well. So for them, I'm not really sure, but for most lifters, I do think if you fail during the bottom position, what I typically done, I try to get them to be more familiar with the bottom position. For example, programming exercises like just squats with stop in the bottom position, pin squats. We have some data that's showing that pin squats can be very effective for increasing one arm strength. But if you, for example, typically have a high sticking point, where we know that the gluteus maximus is very, very important, and you also have increased your forward lean very much. So you see that you have a huge moment arm on the hips. I do think that strengthening hip extensors can be very, very clever. I do think that's obvious. And then, for example, for me, I like to, for example, do squats with bands at the top, because then you take out some of the loading in the bottom position, and then you can overload the top position where the high sticking point is. But again, even if I do that, why do we have a high sticking point? Because really the sticking point, which we typically see, is we define the sticking point, that's where the velocity is at its lowest, but it's not really there the sticking point is. The sticking point is where you are losing acceleration at the fastest rate, which I call in my studies for peak deceleration. So I measured that. But what's really interesting is that we don't really see any difference in kinematic between the point of peak deceleration and the point of minimum velocity. Okay, so pretty much the kinematic is the same there. So you can do your analysis in where the typical sticking point, meaning where the barbell velocity is at its lowest. So yeah, I do think if you have a very hip dominant squat, you have long femurs and so on, you can't really. I do think that straightening your calls, of course, that could be nice, because I know that you've written a great article for this, that specificity is really trying to address things that you need to address. And for example, if you have long femurs, short torso, you can't really do a knee dominant squat. It will often be both spine and hip extensors, and then you can, for example, do less specific movements. So for example, a hack squat, or for example, a leg extension with a profile that's challenging in the bottom position. Because they will train your quadriceps effectively, but you still do need to do squats, because, but I don't think that the squat really target your quadriceps effectively for these kind of persons.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic insight, and some very helpful information, because I've always talked about the sticking region that we visually see as kind of the point where the car is finally stopped after you slam on the brakes, and to train that point, we're missing that, when did you start braking? And the fact that you observe that the point of peak deceleration and also the point of minimum velocity are quite close in terms of where they actually occur in the squat, that's helpful for the practitioner because they can get a better idea of where that is. But it's also helpful just to remember what you said earlier, that quote-unquote stretch reflex, or the eccentric-concentric transition, the contribution of the passive contractile tissue and the rebound that you get out of bouncing out of the hole, depending upon how much you do, is also going to be overlapping with that. So the reason why you stick is multifaceted, but there is always going to be a stick, right? So if we didn't have a sticking point, we'd never miss any lifts. So I think it's helpful for people to simply understand where the sticking region is, because it might give us some insight into what would be the best way to address it. Like you said, if it's in a very bottom position, depending upon the way you squat, it could be potentially more, hip or knee dominant, maybe more knee dominant. And then if it's higher, when the lever arm is longer, and you're more in that kind of bent over position, then it is probably worthwhile strengthening the glutes. Or it might be just, okay, we need to figure out a better way to maintain position, depending upon how much you're getting out of position. So I think, that all makes sense to me. And I think that's really practical information that comes from relatively complex biomechanics. Now, from here, I think it would be cool to talk about training the muscles, because there is, obviously distinction between training for strength or training for hypertrophy. But one of the best predictors for performance in powerlifters is muscle mass. And we see that cross-sectionally much more clearly than we do longitudinally, but I think that has much more to do with the relative change in strength that you see over a typical 6 to 12-week study versus the relative change we see in muscle size by any metric over a 6 to 12-week study, and all the things that contribute to strength change, especially in the short term. But at least in the long term, when we have these cross-sectional studies, we see a moderate to large or strong relationships between various indices of muscle size and strength in powerlifters, which is pretty interesting. So, transitioning to hypertrophy, if people were to look at, say, your last handful of publications, most of them are now not on the sticking region or the squat. They're on measuring hypertrophy. They're on comparing different ranges of motion or similar ranges of motion with different resistance profiles, such that there is a greater challenge in the initial phase of a given movement compared to something else, and also comparing things like lengthened partials, or doing past partial or past full range of motion partials to failure versus lengthened partials. So you've done a lot of important work in this area, and it's really good to see, because I think you've done some very well done studies that have been well controlled and very sober in their interpretations. And you've been building to a very rapidly developing area of research and helped us kind of understand what's going on here. I've referenced a lot of your work. So there's a connection between these two things. Everyone's different. You mentioned that for someone who has, let's say, short torso, long femurs, maybe not even very, very good ankle flexibility, there's no way for them to hit depth without being in a relatively bent over position that looks a little more good morning-esque. And they're not going to be getting quite as much rotation about the knee. They may be just hitting powerlifting depth. And you mentioned that that's not going to be a great movement for the quads for them. So they might be better off doing something like a hack squat, front squat, high bar squat, etc. And that is to, change the demands in the movement so that it can be more quad dominant. And the language around what does quad dominant means is one thing in powerlifting. But when we want to quote unquote bias a muscle group, which is more the language that we use in, say, hypertrophy training or bodybuilding training, one thing that has become a really big focus as of late is muscle length. And obviously, if you were to look at somebody in the bottom position of a low bar squat versus the bottom position of a front squat, you're going to see the, quads in a much more stretched position in the front squat, basically a deeper squat, because you are not limited by the position. You can be more forward shifted, more upright torso, and presumably this would result in more stress across the quads and more hypertrophy, but not necessarily what we're always seeing in all studies, right? So anyway, I would love to get a rundown on kind of your journey into looking at manipulating muscle length and or manipulating the torque demands at longer muscle lengths for a given movement, and your take on this research. So what led you to shifting away from improving squats to actually improving muscle size? And tell us about some of the research you've been doing and what you think you've learned from it or are learning.
Yeah, so that's the story why I shifted from biomechanical research on the squat and also the bench press and deadlift. I do still do studies on them, but it's not my main area of interest, to be honest. The reason why I did that is because I don't really trust the models in biomechanics to try to estimate muscle forces and muscle specific moments, because there are so many assumptions you have to make in your models. For example, just the choice of your model. I've typically used a model that's called Catelli. What that means is that they have made specific changes in wrapping surfaces where the muscle starts and ends. And just by changing that, we can see that the optimal fiber length changes with around, I do think it was around 40 degrees, 30 to 40 degrees for the glutes, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me perfect on that, but it changed. That's the point. And that's just a little, just one thing of the model. And when you have a lot of these choices you have to do, and you have to try to control everything, and you have to try to understand. And also this is often based on cadaver studies, which is not necessarily, I will just say they are not representative of a trained participants at all. It can provide us with some important indications, I do think. But for me, as a researcher, especially when it comes to heavy lifts and resistance training, where the persons and the subjects squat to maximal performance or maximal effort, I don't really trust the findings, because you can get a lot of errors if you don't do everything rigorous and sound. So for me, it was just PhD was just about trying to understand what's going inside the black box. What does my model choices, how does that really, my model choices, how does that lead to the outcomes that I'm interested in? So as I said, midway through my PhD, I decided to do longitudinal studies. So I reached out to Milo, because I know that he was doing a PhD on muscle length, and he was really interested in that. And also to Paul Swinton, which is a really brilliant statistician. So, and also I was managed to recruit a great group of students to do a data collection. So for the data collection, we used, I do think, 4 or 5 months of planning before the data collection, and also around 5 months of training with ultrasound. to do that every day. We trained to try to do it the best way possible to reduce measurement error. So it was a lot of job, and also try to do everything good in our methods. So what we decided to do was that we wanted to compare different leg extension, quick hip traction angles in the leg extension machine, because we know that the rectus femoris, which is a knee extensor contributing to knee extension, it's also a hip flexor, so it can be influenced by hip flexion angle. And we had some studies. I do think it was Mitsui and colleagues that published a study that measured, I do think it was transverse relaxation time, which is a proxy for muscle activation, and found that leaning more backwards to the machine led to greater muscle activation of the rectus femoris, and especially the proximal part, than sitting more upright with around a 90 degrees hip flexion angle. And also, so I wanted to do that. And also, I do think that the lengthened partial research has been really a lot of debated in the last years. And also, but for me as a coach, I also coach a lot of clients for muscle hypertrophy purposes. How I have used this research is just by doing full repetition followed by pass failure partials, meaning that they continue the set with partials after reaching full range of motion failures, especially often on the last set of an exercise in isolation exercises. That's how I employ this kind of research. So for me, I wanted to do a study comparing just full range of motion failure, meaning that we did was that the participant trained calf raises, standing Smith machine calf raises, and this was a within participant design. So this was from the same data collection as the leg extension study, where they on one foot they did calf raises, and we terminated the set when they reached full range of motion failure, meaning that when they were at the top of a peak plank far flexion angle. Whereas on the other foot, they did the same, but they followed with the pass failure partial. So that was something that I was really interested in. And in the third exercise we trained, which has not been pre-printed or published yet, I'm working with it now. We compared shoulder flexion angles. So in one angle, they did bicep curls with a neutral shoulder, meaning that the arm was into the side, whereas for the other condition they did a bicep curl with the shoulder maximal extended, meaning that the arm was behind them, and the resistance profile was similar, meaning that it was peak resistance at a lengthened position. So that was the first data collection, and we wanted to do this just to try to do something other than biomechanics, because I didn't really trust the models. And I don't say that we can't trust the models, that it's just that me, as don't really have a biomechanical background, I've done my best to try to understand everything, but I know that it's so complex, these models. So I wanted to go to something I feel more that I felt that I was going to be more what can I say, sure of. But
Sure.
that was what I thought, because doing longitudinal studies, that's quite hard as well, to be honest. So
Yeah.
we used a lot of time doing pre-registrations, planning everything, preparing the ultrasonography, and so on. And also we did all this for free. That's one thing to remember, because people criticize our studies for having 30 participants. We were a bunch of students that did everything for free. Worked 7 months full-time job, I do think, 6 to 7 months, if I can just estimate, for doing this. So it was a really, really great way for me to do research, because I learned so much, and I was very glad that we did a good preparation for this, because as a researcher, I suspected that this research would get a lot of attention, because people tend to care about muscle hypertrophy studies, and they did. The leg extension study, I had to delete social media after that was published, because for a couple of days, because I couldn't handle all the attention, to be honest. That was just me. I'm just a shy researcher from Norway, but it was very interesting, and so that's really my shift from biomechanical research to doing more longitudinal studies. So do you want me to continue with the findings, or should I? You can just...
Well, first I got to give props and ask questions from, the researcher in me is impressed and I'll tell you why for three reasons. One, your comment about it's not that we can't trust, biomechanics research. It's that you stated, my background isn't biomechanics, so I understand the limitations, but I don't necessarily understand them deep enough to still make the appropriate inferences knowing them. And I think a surface level kind of interpretation by some people when they see limitations on data or they see a funding issue, they just throw it out. And that's a very intellectually lazy thing to do. So I want to just applaud you. There are so many nuances to the methods and the approaches and the results that we see. And it is easy to let things fit your bias or just kind of step away and go, it's too complex. And many people do that instead of taking one of two paths. Well, I need to become an expert on the limitations enough so I can make the limited useful inferences I can to communicate this, or I need to accept that I don't have that expertise, someone else does, so that is not going to be the pathway that I continue in, or I just, I'm straight and straightforward and let you know what I can and can't interpret, the limits of my knowledge. So that is kudos to you. The second thing is I think people just truly don't understand how difficult it is to carry out research like this and how impressive and elegant design can be when you can efficiently collect data. So when you tell me that you managed to do basically, was it 4 studies in one? With this, with three studies in one with this within participant design, I'm very impressed. So you had people doing. So to be clear, this was a within participant study, so that each person, they were their own control, one leg versus the other leg. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're leaning back and doing leg extensions on one leg, and then they're in a normal position doing leg extensions on the other leg. And then they are doing bicep curls on one arm with more shoulder extension, and then less shoulder extension on the other arm. And then finally, they're doing calf raises. Is that accurate? Am I getting it right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So they're doing calf raises, either partials to failure or just one leg to normal full range of motion failure in the same study. Yes.
Yeah, full range of motion failure versus full range of motion failure followed by cast failure, partial failure. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think that is really ingenious from a time perspective. You've got these trained people who are coming in, they're getting to do multiple different exercises. You're increasing your sample size. You're decreasing the degree of within participant and between participant variability because they're serving as their own control. Their stomach's attached to their whole body. So things like nutrition, sleep, etc., all that stuff is controlled for. And also you did this because for the love of the game. This is the way research is, especially in sports science. We're not pulling in huge grants. At best, we're sometimes able to reimburse people for the petrol that they spent to get to the lab, and research assistants are maybe at best getting their name on a paper. So I think you got a deserved amount of attention, even if it did, it was a little challenging to kind of wake up to one morning and go, oh my God, my Instagram is blown up, which I can relate to. And yeah, I think you did a fantastic job. So just researcher to researcher, kudos, because I know how challenging it can be to do research, especially with that length, to get your precision that good with ultrasound and the skills that need to go into it. And I will say that you have produced some of the best research in this area. And you've really strengthened some of the findings we have, even when the conclusion is we don't know, which is totally fine. Strengthening a level of uncertainty is great because we don't want false positives or false negatives. So anyway, that was the first foray into the research, and I would say the data was relatively straightforward. For those who don't know, you observe that doing past failure partials on calf raises produced more hypertrophy than just doing full range of motion. Now, the question is that because they ended up doing basically more volume and reaching quote unquote, true failure when you can no longer even do a partial range of motion on the calves? Yeah, I know you're doing subsequent research on that now, or have done. Correct me if I'm wrong, but leaning back on the leg extension did produce more rectus femoris hypertrophy than being in a more hip flexed normal quote unquote leg extension position. Yes.
Yeah, that results indicated that, yes.
Yep. So those are relatively intuitive. But I know you've done some research where what you anticipated did not quite happen. Are you in a position where you are comfortable talking about the biceps data? Or I know you haven't even pre-printed that. If you want to, save that for once you pre-print it, that's fine. But yeah, up to you. We can talk about that, or we can move on to the subsequent data collection.
We can surely talk about it. I know that it's been talked about a lot already, so it's no problem for me. I haven't looked at the numbers in quite a time now because it's a friend of mine that used the data for his masters. So he did just defended his masters successfully now this week. So congratulations to you, Benjamin. What we did, as you said, we tried to just compare the effects or the impact of shoulder extension angle, because we know that the biceps brachii is a biarticular muscle, meaning that it causes both the shoulder joint and the elbow joints. So it's more lengthened when you do shoulder extension. So what we wanted to do, we recruited 30 untrained men, and we had them trained bicep curl in a cable, where the cable provided the greatest resistance in the lengthened position. So it was around, I do think it was around 40 degrees difference in shoulder angles. So for one angle, for one arm, the shortened condition, they had the arm parallel to the body, whereas for the most lengthened condition, they had full shoulder extension, or around 5 to 10 degrees from full shoulder extension, because obviously if you do full shoulder extension and you push them maximally, it will be discomfortable. So after 10 weeks, we measured elbow flexor thickness, both proximal and distal, before the intervention at 2 baseline tests, and also after the intervention, 72 hours. We had them train twice a week, 8 sets or 4 sets each session, totaling 8 sets to momentary failure, meaning that they failed the last repetition. And after the intervention, we didn't find any differences. And that was quite surprising for me, because they were much stronger when they extended their shoulder. It was, I do think, 25, 4 or 20 out of the 23 or 24 participants that finished the study was substantially stronger in the extended conditions. So for me, it was there's really no difference there. I haven't really looked into the data in a couple of months. I'm not sure if it's trending one way, but if I recall correctly, I do think that for one of the for one of the sides, the proximal side, they favored the shortened condition. So I can't relay anything for sure. So that's what we call sampling variance can be, but it also can just reflect that there aren't really any differences, I think. So that's, for me, was quite surprising there. But we also have a lot of data, or not a lot of data, but we have some studies on the bicep now. I do think it was a study that was published a couple of weeks ago that didn't really find a difference either, if I remember correctly. So
yeah, this is an interesting one. We've got, I think, almost 5 studies now comparing incline curls to preacher curls. I think Zabaleta Corta, Kobayashi has a conference abstract, Cassiano, and the one that was just published. So it's I'm really glad you brought up sampling variance or sampling error. It's something we've talked about a lot on Iron Culture, and you kind of have to take a step back and ask yourself, what should I expect to see when I compare these things, or what would I, hypothesize I would see? What is the magnitude of difference? And then if I'm looking at multiple small sample size studies, okay, what is the degree of variance that I will see in those? And it's not that we might, it's that we should see some studies that are giving us results probably in the direction of what we'd expect, but the majority of studies will probably not find anything at all. And the final thing I'll say, and this is because I've had some good talks with Dr. Mao, when I said Kobayashi, that's out of his lab in Japan, there are some methodological differences that are quite important here. I would love to get your thoughts on this, but it's very difficult to differentiate when you're looking at the distal bicep site with ultrasound between the brachialis, which sits deep to the bicep and is monoarticular, so it won't be impacted by, shoulder position, and the distal biceps brachii. They're kind of like right on top of each other. The intra or intermuscular separation between them is very challenging to see, but on MRI, apparently it's much easier. And what has been reported in some studies, which is, I think by Zabaleta Corta, greater distal elbow flexor growth, like broadly, might specifically be, brachialis growth in that preacher curl, where you're manipulating shoulder angle, which doesn't impact the brachialis, but you're creating a more favorable resistance profile because your forearm's more parallel to the ground. And then when you do something like a incline curl where you're stretching that biceps brachii, now that's really only benefiting the biceps because it is a poorer resistance profile, but at least you're getting the stretch. So on the bicep because it's biarticular, like you mentioned. So I think that's really interesting. So I think there are two things at play here. There's one, sampling error, sampling variance, and there is also methodological differences where some of these differences may not be interpreted the same way, whether we're using, an MRI assessment of muscle volume compared to a assessment of muscle thickness or even cross-sectional area if you can do it with, like extended field of view ultrasound. So anyway, those are my thoughts, but I know you've done this direct research. I'd love to get yours on some of the emerging biceps data.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, Eric. That's exactly my thought as well, because as you say, the brachialis is a monoarticular elbow flexor, so it's not really affected by shoulder extension angle. But if we can just talk shortly about the studies that measure this, so Zabaleta Corta did, so I do think it was just that the incline curl, they increased, I don't remember if it was the proximal distal part, but the increase it was just the incline curl that increased, I do think. But we also have a publication from Cassian and colleague that was published earlier this year, I think, where they also compared preacher curl to incline curls, and they measured elbow flexor thickness, meaning combined brachialis and biceps brachii at the proximal and distal part. And what was very interesting here was that they found that the distal part of the bicep of the elbow flexor increased more from preacher curls, where you increase resistance in the more stretched position. But whereas for the incline curl, they increase the elbow flexor thickness more at the proximal part, where you only have the biceps brachii, because you don't really have. In my studies, I haven't really found any brachialis so long up on so proximally on the femur, on the humerus. I'm sorry. So that's quite interesting, and that's also something that's aligned with the conference abstract by Mayo's lab, where they did use MRI, because when I looked at elbow flexor thickness in the study where I measured, where we tried to manipulate shoulder extension variable in the pre-registration, we planned to do bicep brachii and brachialis, if I remember correctly, but I didn't understand what I was seeing when I looked at the distal part, because it was so hard to distinguish. So we decided to just do elbow flexor, because we couldn't really distinguish these things. But back to the Mayo paper, they found that they observed in the conference abstract, it's just a conference abstract, I haven't read the entire thing, but they found that preacher curl increased brachialis at the distal part, I do think, to a greater extent, and the incline curve, where you're laying backwards into a bench and you're lengthening your biceps via shoulder extension, increase the bicep brachii more. So for me, that's quite, if I can't say compelling, but it provides us with some indications that if you want to really have regional differences in elbow flexor, do for example, it could be a good idea to do a preacher curl for the brachialis and incline curls for the bicep brachii. So that's my take on it. And also, I'm very skeptical about saying this. So for me, it's speculative what I say now, but when you are increasing shoulder flexion angle, you are shortening the biceps brachii over the shoulders. So it can potentially weaken it a little bit because it may reach the ascending limb of the length-tension relationship, which means that actin and myosin filaments could potentially, this is very speculative for me, have a suboptimal overlap, which can perhaps, I'm not saying it do that the brachialis may contribute more. So it has to do, but that's just very speculative. I'm very, I try to avoid these speculations, but for me, combining that it has greater resistance, that the brachialis have greater resistance in the preacher together, that the bicep brachii are shortened more, could possibly, both these things can possibly influence this. But for the practitioner, I do think that this doesn't really have so much to say, because I don't really think that you can see any differences, and the nets, the net increase are similar. The net increases are similar, but the distal part can probably grow some more of the elbow flexors, can probably grow some more from preacher curves, and opposite for the incline curve, where you increase the proximal part or the upper part. But I would just want to say something from our data collection when we are speaking about resistance profiles, because even though our participants were stronger in the where they have their shoulder extended, it's very important for me to say that we standardized the resistance profile there. The other studies didn't. So for us, we had the cable horizontally, so it was 90 degrees from the elbow at peak extension, elbow extension, meaning it was hardest when the bicep or the elbow flexor was at its most lengthened. But I, as a trainer, because I follow the participants, what was a really interesting observation here was that they failed at high angular accelerations. So suddenly they failed, because one repetition it was easy, and then they suddenly failed. And I believe this could be due to, what I've read, I never measured this myself, that the bicep brachii has decreased internal moment arm when you fully extend the elbow. So it's a little bit weaker in full extension due to smaller internal leverage of the muscle. That's speculative for me. I don't like to say things if I haven't even measured it myself and don't fully understand it, because I haven't seen the images myself, but I trust the researchers. So for me, I speculate that having a resistance profile in bicep curl that peaks at peak muscle length is not beneficial, because you suddenly fail when you fully extend the elbow, because you have smaller internal moment arm. So me personally would really like to replicate these findings, but with a resistance profile that's a little bit nicer in the stretch position, because I do think that the participants could have pushed a little bit further. But this was standardized, so it shouldn't really make any differences. But for me, it was just an interesting observation. So yeah.
No, and that's the kind of stuff you love to hear, because it matches, at least it matches my experience and what I've seen in the trenches. It's like when you get into some of these extreme positions, sometimes failure can be very abrupt for certain muscle groups, at least. And you can kind of intuitively, and I think there's value to this, although it's difficult to know exactly why, intuitively go, that's probably too much of a shoulder extension angle, I'll be in some shoulder extension, but not a tremendous amount. And then it also opens the door for, like if that failure, quote unquote, came out of nowhere, maybe I want to do some partials past failure, or I want to do a drop set, or I want to make sure that my desire to try to train this muscle to longer length is not limiting my volume, So it's kind of the idea of not throwing some of the other programming principles out with the bathwater, and how when we start to isolate a variable or isolate a muscle group, there are other factors at play. So I think that complexity, that nuance, and the things that we're still trying to figure out exactly why is important. So that's great. And I think the degree to which you speculate is still very conservative. So you're doing fine in my book, and I think it's important because people can understand maybe why we saw what we saw. So after this, it didn't sound like you got enough punishment, Stian, because I know you did more research after that, despite the fact that it took so much time, effort, and that it blew up your social media in a way that made you remove Instagram from your phone. So talk to me about the more recent research you've done, the follow-up, and then I guess finally, I think it would be good to finish with what you have planned in the future and where we think we need to go with this line of research.
Yeah, sure. So after this data collection, we got funding. So that was really great. So Milo, he had a really great guy asking if he could fund our studies. So for me, yeah, of course. So that was really great that he did. So thanks for that. But really what we wanted to do after this was just to continue and trying to do some interesting studies. I am really interested in exercise selection. So I wanted to take it a step further and try to do it on more trained participants. So I look at myself as I do think that you are a specialist, but also a generalist. But for me, I'm just a generalist. So for me, when I do studies, I really like to try to recruit experts on the field, so I know that the methods are rigorous and sound. So we also recruited Brad Schoenfeld, which is a really great researcher, to participate in the other data collection. So I do think it was January this year. No, we had January this year. Yeah, no, last year. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. It was last year, the spring last year. So we started a new data collection. We managed to recruit, I think it was 25 or 26 trained participants with, I do think the average training that I trained for 7 or 7.2 years. So it was pretty trained participants, and because I ran the fitness center at that time, so it was pretty easy to recruit, and it was a good friends of mine, and they volunteered, so really happy for that. But we did three exercises, so we did 3 studies in one data collection. So the first thing we did was that we for me, I'm very interested in cold training and how to try to optimize cold training. And I know that it's been done a lot of studies on different or not a lot of studies, some studies that have compared different range of motion on quadriceps femoris growth. So I wanted to do a study that compared around 100 degrees of knee flexion angle versus a peak individualized peak knee flexion angle on quadriceps or hypertrophy. So what we did was that we recruited 25 participants. We hadn't trained leg press. This was also within participant design. So on one leg, they trained to 100 degrees knee flexion, and the other, they trained to peak individualized knee flexion, which was an average of around 156 degrees, I think. So it was the largest range of motion in the literature on the knees. And we compared quadriceps growth between conditions at 6 different sites on the quads, and we didn't find any differences, just to say it short. This was an 8-week intervention. It was trained participants. They didn't really grow much at all, which wasn't really interesting. So for me, it can give us some indications, but honestly, I would really like to see this study replicated with more participants, longer training interventions, but still 8 weeks, doing 8 sets, two weekly training session with a total of 8 sets to momentary failure in the leg press, and they trained to momentary failure, believe me, in almost every set. Of course, you can't push them on every set, but we tried our really best, so they failed most of the sets. That's so hard. So they grew, but we didn't find any differences. But for me, they could probably due to sampling variance, but still, in our pre-registered hypothesis, our hypothesis was that it would be similar quad growth. That's important to say, and we also had, I do think it was moderate evidence of the null hypothesis in Bayesian terms. When they did a multivariate analysis, meaning combining all the sites, you had extreme evidence of the null hypothesis, and there was really no trends in any six sites on the quads that there were any differences. So for me, it provides us with some indications. It can be a true difference. I don't know, because we also have measurement error. But that was the first study. And also what we based our hypothesis on was that, I do think it was the Kubo study. We had the Bloomquist study that I know that you already covered, that saw that 60 degrees versus, they compared 60 versus 120 degree squat, I think, and found greater quad growth for the 120 degree condition. And also then we had the McMahon study that combined the several exercises where they compared 90 to 50 degrees of knee flexion and found greater quad growth for the 90. And then finally they have the Kubo study that's compared 140 to 90 degrees of knee flexion and found no differences in quad growth, but obviously also greater glute growth and adductor growth when you had a full squat. So based on that, we based our hypothesis on that, and that it wouldn't be any differences. For me, I don't really think that going past 100 to 110 degrees of knee flexion angle is beneficial, because you get a lot of weaker. You will probably don't reach a stronger part of your length-tension relationship. I'm very skeptical of estimation of the length-tension relationship, but because I do think that's quite complex. But still, I don't really think that going so deep has a benefit for the quads. But still, from a practitioner perspective, I do think that it's good to know that you can still both do heavy ego leg presses to 100 degrees knee flexion and also peak individualized knee flexion to your heel lifts off the plate and get comparable quad growth. So that's the first study. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to ask me something?
No, let's talk about that. No, I think this is one of those things where, and for pure transparency, folks, I have done some peer review on some of these papers. I had the pleasure of doing that. And yeah, again, great work, awesome design, really important research question. And I think the hypothesis is interesting, because some people, they would probably look at some of the isometric work that's been done on the quadriceps, or some of the knee extension work like you did, even, or that Pedrosa has done, and go, oh, longer muscle length, the better, more stress at a deeper position, the better. But when you, like you said, when you look at Bloomquist, when you look at McMahon, when you look at Kubo, when we have things that are, comparable, it almost seems like there's a consistent pattern. I don't know if we're there yet, to where, at least in squatting patterns at high degrees of knee flexion, there doesn't seem to be a benefit for the quads, even though there is a benefit for the adductor and the glutes. So I think the practitioner, at least for someone who's trying to grow all muscle groups evenly, or just all muscle groups generally, would say, okay, cool. Well, I still want to go as deep as possible. Maybe not for my quads, but there is a point where deep enough is deep enough. Or let's say, shallow is too shallow, and it's probably somewhere between 60 to 90 degrees or something like that. But once you're getting into like the 3-digit range, for knee flexion, which looks like, I don't know, slightly more than a half squat, slightly more than a half leg press, if you kind of think about this in practical terms, that actually seems to be sufficiently deep for the quadriceps, which is interesting. So yeah, I think your research is helping us understand that there's more to this than simply longer is better. There are points at which the length of the muscle may cause other issues, but we're also can't just isolate a compound movement to a single muscle group. So no, I think that's really interesting findings. I'm really curious to see more come out of the lab. And this is, to your point, the fact that you saw very little hypertrophy at all in this trained group of individuals is something we need to constantly remember, that just because there's no difference or no practical or no meaningful, whatever statistical model you use, if there's no difference between groups, but there was also no difference from pre to post, it's very difficult to make any conclusion at all. And this is why I think it is sometimes valuable to study untrained or even just recreationally trained participants, because you're more likely to observe growth at all in a given 8 or 12-week window. And I do think if something makes a novice grow faster, it will probably make an advanced lifter grow faster as well. It's just that faster for an advanced lifter might mean, oh yeah, it takes me 6 months to observe a measurable change instead of a year. So while it might be something like a measurable change that is larger over 8 weeks versus smaller over 8 weeks, but still measurable in both cases for a novice. So all of those complexities are layered on top of one another, but I think it's great that you're contributing to this research, and those are my thoughts on the quadriceps stuff.
Thank you. So just to follow up, because it's something that I've given some thoughts about later months, because what is long muscle length? What's the definition of long muscle length? Is it when it reaches the descending limb of the length-tension relationship? And does that really matter? What is the descending limb? This is very hard things to measure, I think. For me, is it when you have peak joint range of motion in your joint? I discussed this with my girlfriend, which I also, she's a co-author on all my papers here, so she's been very important, so shout out to her, Nordi Sandberg. But we have discussed this as well, because for me, I do think that for the quads, you don't get you never feel a stretch in them, but still I do think that you have great force production around 90 to 70 degrees of a knee angle. I do think we have some mechanistic data that suggests that going below 110 can decrease the optimal range of force production. Still, I can't say anything about that data because it's complex, but still, for me, what is a long muscle length? What is it? It's a definition question. For me, I am very, very unsure if we can really say that. We can say that a muscle is trained at a longer muscle length, but is it meaningful enough, if you understand? Can it mediate that or activate some pathways that's not activated? I don't know, and I don't really think as a community we can't really say anything for sure because we aren't there yet. I do think measuring these things and connecting mechanistical data to longitudinal data is quite complex. I know that some labs try, and big shout out to them. I haven't tried that myself because I'm a practitioner. I don't feel comfortable doing that, but I do think that's a really important area of future research to understand really what a long muscle length is. It can be that someone has an answer, but for me, I'm very unsure, to be honest.
And I think that's a really, really important point. Terminology is everything. And having an objective definition of when a muscle is at a long length is, I don't think we're there yet. Right now, all we know is one group is longer than the other, and that's all we can say, right? So, and you know, I think that's fine as a practitioner. Like you said, we don't necessarily get the like, you know, people will sometimes make comments about, well, what's going to optimize muscle protein synthesis? I even remember being asked that at a conference for personal trainers, and I said, oh, so are you doing biopsies or are you doing the microdialysis technique of looking at muscle protein synthesis? How do you measure muscle protein synthesis? Like, I'm a trainer. I'm like, then it doesn't matter. Like, that's a good theoretical understanding so you can understand why. But as far as what data you need to be looking at, it's stuff that you can actually apply in the gym. So I won't go down that rabbit hole. But so this is not the only part of this research study. You know, you got funded, which is great. You've done the deeper versus deep enough, apparently. Squats. What else did this research entail? What other findings have recently come out of it? And then finally, we can close with, what do you plan to do in the future, and what does the future look like for Dr. Larsen?
Yeah, sure. So just going through the two findings briefly. So we compared calf raises. So we compared just lengthened partial calf raises versus doing full range of motion calf raises followed by past failure partials. And our hypothesis there was that lengthened partial would be superior. And that was that was also what our data indicated. If I recall correctly, we had anecdotal evidence that lengthened partial was beneficial to pass failure partial. It was around 0.4 greater millimeter greater average treatment effects, as we call it in very sim terms, for the lengthened partial. So just doing lengthened, so it was calf raises, dynamic smith machine calf raises here, and that provided greater growth of the calf, but it was still just anecdotal. But that's some indications, and it's hard to measure these things because we also have measurement errors, and this was trained individuals. So yeah, so this data indicates that just doing past failure partial, initial partial was better than past failure partials. Yeah.
So to clarify to the listener, you had one group doing full range of motion calf raises, and then essentially just let their range of motion decay until they're barely moving and failed. So this is doing typical training and then going, you know what, I'm just going to go till I can't move. And now, unlike the prior study, you compared this to what if we only did, the first half, the initial range of motion. And that seemed to be potentially, although this is just one study comparing the two, slightly better, which, you can always post hoc rationalize as to why a small change that may or may not be real, if we were to replicate this study, is the case. But at least it kind of makes sense. It is quite challenging when you do the final portion of a calf raise, and we have a lot of prior data on calves indicating they do respond well to being trained in a lengthened position. We can look at Castellanos full range versus lengthened partial data, which is one of the strongest data points we have in that area. So I think it makes sense. You're not expending any energy in this quote unquote less than optimal position, and you are going to failure in both conditions. So I think that tracks. I wouldn't be surprised if it was replicated and we didn't see a significant difference or a meaningful difference. And I would expect probably most studies comparing two things like this would not, because we're now really getting into the weeds for the listener. Now we're comparing two different calf raises, both exposing the person to failure and in the lengthened position. So now we are going to get to a point where we're going to reach the limits of what research can even discern. And I think that is important. We're comparing good versus best. At this point, many times we're just not going to be able to pick that up until we have 10 studies and a meta-regression to look at. But kudos to you for that. I think that's a great question. And at least it addresses the limitation of the prior study where you did full range of motion to failure versus past failure. And you said, well, one group's getting more volume, and what if we did a comparison where we're going full range of motion, then past failure, to only partials and then going to failure. So I think from a successive perspective of when you're building research questions upon one another and prior findings, I think it's a well done study and important. So what was the final component to this most recent data collection? Because this one also had 3 studies as a part of it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the last component of this data collection was that they compared lateral raises variations. So this was the first study that I know of that have measured lateral deltoid muscle thickness increases during an intervention. So this was really something we put a lot of work into before starting with measuring. We did pilot testing and measured the lateral data at multiple sites to try to find the best way forward. But what we did was that we had the same participants train lateral raises. So for one arm, they trained lateral raises with a dumbbell, whereas for the other arm, they trained with a cable. So we really wanted to see how resistance profile influences the muscle hypertrophy outcome of the lateral deltoid. So for the dumbbell, you have what's called an ascending resistance profile, because the dumbbell has its longest moment arm at the shortened position, where your arm is out from the body. So it's an increased resistance, whereas the cable was attached. So the cable was around hip height. So it had peak resistance in the more lengthened position. And here it's very important that the listeners know that we standardized shoulder range of motion, because we wanted to isolate how resistance profile impact these things. So the participants trained twice a week, 4 sets each session to momentary failure. I think it was 12 to 14 repetition rep range. I don't remember, to be honest, but they trained to momentary failure. And also we tried to match repetition tempo. So I do think it was 1 second concentric eccentric, but this was very hard because when you have a dumbbell, you want to try to do momentum. So in real life, when they reach better, this was very hard, even if we tried our best, because it was train lifters. They have lifted for many years, many of them. So it was hard. So I do think that that's kind of influenced the outcome. So what we found was that we measured muscle thickness increases at both the more distal part of the lateral deltoid and the proximal part, and we didn't find really any data that supports that there were any difference. I do think also here we had moderate evidence for the null hypothesis, meaning no really difference. And the proximal part, I do think, had non-significant greater growth for the dumbbells and opposite for the cable for distal part. So really no difference there. But of course, we had measurement error here. It was short intervention and they grew very little. So I would really like to see this study replicated, and somehow I know that this is being done now by Jeremy Etter, so kudos to him and Coach Kassem, I do think. So I'm really interested in seeing what they will find, because this was just the first study. We did our best to try to do it, but and also something that I want to see, that even if you can do an analysis of the resistance profile on a picture, and you can see that, yeah, here you have greater moment arm. When you have an acceleration component into this thing, these things changes. So the resistance profile wasn't really that difference when the participants in your study started self-organizing at the top of the lift. So at the bottom of the lift. So yeah, there was some greater resistance, of course, with the cable at the more lengthened part, but I speculate. I didn't measure the resistance profile. It's hard to do, but when you have dynamic resistance into it, but I don't really think it was so big difference. But I'm a practitioner. That's what I care about. Do you get more gains with the cable? So next step now that I want to see replicated is to do a similar study, but increase range of motion with a cable, because that's something that you can do as a practitioner. So because I do think most people probably do the cable with a little bit greater range of motion. So yeah, that's the finding.
No, it totally makes sense. It's very difficult to maintain the same degree of quote unquote strictness, and maybe you shouldn't, on a dumbbell lateral raise compared to a cable lateral raise. And you know, this one hurt to read. I'll be honest. My bias, it's like, I believe that the cable training is far better for the delts. And so, you know, reading the results of this study, I had mixed feelings. One, it was really cool because, like you said, it's the first time we've seen the deltoid measured via ultrasound, or period for hypertrophy that I'm aware of. And it's a great comparison, super practical. So great job on that. Let me ask you, is it hard to measure the deltoid? Is this something people haven't done, or is it something people haven't done because it's very challenging?
I don't think it wasn't so challenging. So what we did was that we did a pilot. I don't remember exactly where we measured it. It's because it's a long time ago. But when we did it on the places where we did it, it was quite okay. We didn't have a lot of measurement error, but it was more challenging at the proximal part than the distal part, because the distal part was pretty easy. So we have the study now to peer review. This is a preprint, so we are in the finalization stages of the peer review, and there we have attached images of the ultrasound so the people can see when it's published. So, but still, yeah, it was a little bit harder for the proximal part. So we had to really to do our best to try to standardize these things to do it the best way. But for me, it wasn't the worst muscle that I measured. I tried to measure the glutes several times now, but I never done an intervention. That's quite hard. I like the Cassiano methods from his Citrus study, and this is just me rattling. But I do think the glutes is quite hard, so that's why it's not really been done. But I want to do a glute study next, so yeah, that's the next thing for me, I think.
No, I'm excited for the horizons, because there's, you know, AI assisted MRI work now that's becoming more feasible, and honestly, that's great to hear that the deltoid is actually relatively easy to measure, and I think it's just been something that people haven't done it. It's not an obvious thing for people to do. So hopefully this will spur even more research into this area, and we'll get more answers as they come. So first off, Stian, I just want to say thank you for the work you've done. Thank you for taking the time to be on Iron Culture. And the last question I have for you is, what's new in store for you, and where can people find you? So what's on the horizon, and then if people are more interested in your work, what's the best way to follow it?
Yeah, the easiest way to find me is on Instagram. Coach Stian is my name there if people want to follow my work. Also, ResearchGate is fine, Stian Larsen there. And next up for me is to doing a great job for AFPT and SPEN. I just started as head of education there, and we are trying to expand now. So I'm really, really excited by being there, helping their education with updating their curriculum and their studies and making new studies. So that's next. But I'm very interested in doing a new data collection. I'm planning to do it in the start of January. I will not say what I will do, but it's something similar to what we have done. I will try to do several studies out of one data collection, because I do think that's most time efficient. And also I like to do that to the participants when they train. We can get the most out of it, because this costs resources. So I do think that's an ethical thing to do as well, to be honest. So yeah, that's the next thing. So yeah, thank you.
No, awesome. That is fantastic. And you know what? I don't know how to give better praise to an organization committed to education when they decide they want to hire a head of research. Who do they look to? An up and coming, head of education, up and coming recent researcher in the areas of hypertrophy and strength. To me, that's awesome. So that's why I'm rocking the AFPT shirt. And I'll drop some hints that I think AFPT is doing such a good job that there may even be some collaborations in the future. So folks, keep a close eye out. Exciting things are coming. I want to wish you a big, huge congratulations on completing your doctorate, also getting hired and working with such good people at AFPT. And I want to offer a big thanks for the work you're doing in our field, pushing it forward, the tireless, sometimes thankless work, sometimes even heavily criticized work that researchers do in this area. And looking forward to potentially have you back on Iron Culture when those future studies, which you won't even drop a hint about, are going to happen. He's keeping us in suspense, folks, but that's okay. And then to you, dear listener, let me just say, make sure you give Stian a follow. Follow him over at Instagram, follow him over at ResearchGate if you're so inclined to directly engage with the research. And also, please do give us a like, a subscribe, a 5-star rating. And next time we're live, make sure to join us on YouTube. I'll be back with Trex. And if you really want to be a top-tier supporter of the Iron Cult, consider checking out massresearchreview.com, where we cover research just like this. I have covered, and we have covered multiple studies that have been done on this topic in Mass Research Review if you want to get our in-depth take and you can understand all these limitations and how to apply it. So once again, thanks for listening, folks, and we will see you next time on Iron Culture.